Stax and Buzz, two players that have been around Valorant since its inception. Two legendary Korean Valorant players that have been playing on pro teams since the beginning of pro play. They have come such a long way to finally take their very first trophy in the VCT at VCT Masters Bangkok. It took them 5 years and basically 3 separate organizations to do it. This is the story of Buzz and Stax. So this is the board we have today. On the board we have every single international tournament that these two players have played in. They have been together since the very beginning, starting out as a team called Vision Strikers. Now Stax was the first out of the two to join this team, originally joining in 2020 before the VCT had even started because, as we all know, the world was shut down that year. And then Buzz joined this team in 2021 and they became one of the longest standing rosters in Valorant history, but we'll get to that as we go through it. Right now, we're starting at their very first international appearance, which was in 2021 at the second international tournament in Valorant's history, Masters Berlin. Even though they won Korea's in-region Masters, Vision Strikers would not qualify for VCT Masters Reykjavik, the very first international tournament in this game's history. However, making it to Masters Berlin, they were hoping to make some noise, again, as this young, very talented Korean roster. And while they didn't go super deep into this tournament, they would managed to get a pretty respectable 5th to 8th placement, losing in the first round of playoffs to Gambit, the team that would eventually go on to win that tournament. So even though they went out at playoffs, it was still a showcase that this team can hang at the international level. They did manage to take a map off of Gambit. They did eventually lose 13 to 8 on Icebox to end their tournament, but hey, it's still progress at the international level, showing that Korea, as well as teams like Newturn before them, can be a region to be reckoned with. Buzz at that tournament had 124 kills, 101 deaths, 16 assists for a KD ratio of a very impressive 1.22. Stax, on the other hand, good numbers for him as well, 103 kills, 88 deaths, 49 assists, and a KD ratio of 1.17. So they had a good, not great debut at the international level. However, their next tournament would not be the same. At Champions 2021, they did get grouped. They ended up placing 9th to 12th, losing to C9 in that very last match of the group stage that they needed to win to qualify for the playoffs. And C9 wouldn't do much in that international tournament after beating Vision Strikers. Fun fact, that is the last international tournament that C9 has qualified for. No, lock-in does not count. Sorry C9 fans, I just wanted to throw a stray while I had the chance. At that tournament, Buzz had 136 kills, 122 deaths, 25 assists for a KD ratio of 1.11, whereas Stax would have 126 kills, 119 deaths, 47 assists for a 1.05. So both players having very respectable performances. But anyway, that was not the kind of progression that this team wanted. However, they would enter 2022 under a new banner, DRX. Still the same organization, DRX was the parent company of the company that owned Vision Strikers, so this was just them rebranding. And 2022 would end up being a very pivotal year for this team, starting at Reykjavik 2022. So this time qualifying for the first international of the year. In that group stage, they ended up beating Zeta Division and Ninjas in Pajamas to make it to the playoff stage. However, after beating Paper X in the first round of playoffs, they went on to face Optic. They then lost that match, knocking them down to the lower bracket where they would face Zeta Division, and they lost the rematch. And that was where their tournament would end there. 5th to 6th placement, get used to that number. Zeta ended up going on a pretty impressive run at that tournament, kind of coming out of nowhere and placing 3rd. And DRX got kind of punked by them on that last map. They lost 13 to 4. And Reykjavik 2022 was a very interesting tournament when it came to teams from Asia. Before the VCT partnership system, for those that do not know, all the regions were split. Korea was its own region, APAC was its own thing, Japan as well. So all these teams were not combined into what we know as the VCT Pacific League. And at this tournament, this is where a lot of these Asian teams from those different regions ended up performing quite well. However, they were not winning trophies, so they were trying to stand up to the North American teams and the European teams that up until that point had dominated the scene. They were showing that these regions were very viable and could perform well at these tournaments. Unfortunately, no team from Asia would win until 2024. However, out of the 3 Asian teams that were in that playoff bracket in that tournament, DRX placed the lowest. Buzz at that tournament had 208 kills, 196 deaths, 73 assists for a KD ratio of 1.06. Stax, on the other hand, had pretty good numbers for himself too, 197 kills, 173 deaths, 91 assists for a KD ratio of better than Buzz's 1.13. So a lot of progress for Asian teams at this tournament, but can they do better at Copenhagen? Unfortunately, DRX could not get that done, going out at the same exact placement of 5th to 6th, starting what would be kind of a curse for this team. They don't always place that, but as you can see on the board, it does happen quite a bit. They had a very solid group stage, then they went on to face Leviathan. They ended up beating them in that playoff bracket, but then they ended up facing Optic, a team that they are familiar with at this point, and they lost that one again. Then getting knocked down to the lower bracket, they would lose to the eventual tournament winners in FPX, a roster that would become Na'Vi the next year, so not the Chinese team that we know today. So yet again, losing to the tournament winners the second time that they did that. Buzz at that tournament had 178 kills, 160 deaths, 28 assists for a KD ratio of 1.11. Stax, 191 kills, 171 deaths, 100 assists for another 1.11 KD ratio. So both players performing very consistently. They're always putting up good numbers. Even Stax, who isn't the duelist player while Buzz was, or at least at that time he was Chamber, who was essentially a duelist in 2022, but we don't have to talk about that. So it was the same result for this roster that was hoping to have some upward progression at Copenhagen, especially seeing another Asian team in PaperX go all the way to the grand finals and almost winning against FPX. There were many teams in the 2022 season that were gunning for Asia's first trophy. Unfortunately, DRX just never seemed to be able to do it. They always looked really solid for much of a tournament, but when it came to that 5th to 6th placement or before, it would kind of crumble. However, at Champions 2022, we would see this team go deeper, getting their highest placement to date of 3rd, losing to Optic Gaming. They beat Furia and 100 Thieves in that group stage. They would get the revenge on FPX in that first round of playoffs, then they would go on to face Loud. They would lose that match, sending them down to the lower bracket, but then they started to have a pretty impressive run, beating Fnatic and then facing FPX for a second time that tournament and winning it. And then they went on to face Optic Gaming, a team that they were quite familiar with at that point, and they almost did it. They almost got the reverse sweep on them, but they could not get it done. Optic would win that best of 5 and move on to the Grand Finals of Champions, where they would eventually lose to Loud. So in these 5 tournaments so far that we've talked about, they've lost to the winner of the tournament twice. So 2022 comes to an end in not the way that they would have wanted. However, this 3rd place finish would show that this roster maybe can win a tournament. They finally break past 5th place and end up getting that top 3 finish, facing off against a very good team in Optic for that very first best of 5 that they did at the international level. They just could not get it done, but still, there was a lot of hope for this DRX roster, a roster that at this point had been together for 5 separate international tournaments. There were some players that were in and out, but for the most part, it was this core of Buzz, Stax, Mako, as well as RB and Zest. Lakia was in and out during the Vision Strikers era. Bane was also a part of the Vision Strikers for a little bit as well. He didn't show up until 2024, but yeah, that was the thing that happened, and Buzz and Stax were doing their best to keep their team alive during that Champions 2022 run. Buzz ended up having 324 kills, 311 deaths, 73 assists for KD ratio of 1.04. Stax, not as good numbers, but still solid overall, 268 kills, 270 deaths, 105 assists for KD ratio of 0.99. So, we're heading into the partnership era, 2023, lock-in. This was a tournament that had every single team that was a part of the VCT partnership system, plus some Chinese teams. So, if DRX were able to go on a good run in this one, it would be very impressive. And they would go on that deep run, eventually getting to 3rd to 4th placement, beating BBL, C9, and Talon to make it to that top 4 appearance, and then eventually facing off against Loud. Loud playing in their hometown of Sao Paulo, they were not going to let DRX win this one. However, DRX made it quite close, yet again, almost getting a reverse sweep. Just like they almost did to Optic at Champions 2022, they almost did it to Loud here, but it just could not get it done. Buzz at that tournament had 227 kills, 201 deaths, 56 assists, and a KD ratio of 1.12. Stax, on the other hand, 185 kills, 191 deaths, 103 assists for a KD ratio of 0.96. So what we're starting to see is Buzz is still performing at a high level, but Stax's numbers are starting to dip just that little bit. Still impressive numbers overall. He was also the IGL at points, sometimes he wasn't, sometimes he was. DRX and their IGL position was a bit of a mess throughout this roster's history, so they essentially get the same exact placement that they had at Champions the year prior. So while it could be seen as yet another good sign of upward progression, they lost yet another best of 5 at the international level, losing to the eventual runner-up of that tournament, the second tournament in a row that they did that. That has got a stain. This is now the 6th tournament in a row that this roster had been together, and now that these Asian teams were grouped into the VCT Pacific League, it was only going to get harder. Now you have to consistently play against teams like Paper X, a team that had their number for quite some time. Now you have to consistently play against some of these top teams from other Asian regions, so nothing was getting easier for DRX. And after having a strong run in the regular season stage of 2023, they were the runners-up in their own region, losing the regional trophy. Tokyo was seen as a very important tournament for this region. The very first tournament on Asian soil, not in the same country as VCT Pacific is run, that's in Seoul in Korea, but it was Asia nonetheless. So the teams coming out of VCT Pacific, DRX being one of them, they were hoping to go on a strong run. However, this would be probably DRX's most disappointing placement to date. They ended up starting the tournament pretty rocky. They did make it out of the group stage, but it wasn't easy for them. After being attacking Seoul Esports, they went on to face Evil Geniuses, who at the time wasn't seen as the huge contender that they ended up being at that tournament, and DRX lost that one. They would have to win against Foot to be able to make it into that playoff stage, and that playoff stage just ended up being a disaster for this team. They ended up facing off against Paper X in the playoff stage, so a team that they're used to at this point, but a team that at that point had DRX's number, and nothing really changed from that 2-0 victory for Paper X there, knocking DRX down to the lower bracket where they would face Energy, the remains of the Optic roster, and just like in matches past, that roster would be able to beat DRX. 2-0 victory for Energy there, and the last map was a 13-5 win. So after 2 straight third place finishes, they end up placing 7th to 8th. It was just a disaster for this team, a lot higher hopes for them. Buzz with his worst stats on the board in this one, he had 169 kills, 167 deaths, 40 assists for a KD ratio of 1.01, whereas Stax 130 kills, 167, 108 assists for a KD ratio of 0.77, his worst on the board. So just an abysmal tournament for this DRX roster that was really hoping to make an impact. With this DRX roster, it always felt like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. They had this roster that had been together since 2021, with barely any changes to the roster, the same coaching staff, not many changes going on, and they still ended up being consistently quite good. And that's a rarity in Valorant esports. It's a rarity in a lot of esports. Having rosters that can stay together for a very long time yet still be consistently high performing, that's a gift. However, unlike some of those rosters that stay together for a very long time, they didn't show much at the international level that justified this roster and the coaching staff being together for as long as they did. Yes, they were always able to make it to these international tournaments. Yes, they had some good placements here and there, but they just were not able to get over that hump that had been plaguing Pacific teams at the international level since 2021. However, we move on to Champions 2023. Does it get better? Not by much. 5th to 6th placement yet again. They made it out of the group stage at Champions looking quite strong. They did beat Loud, as well as Na'Vi, 2 teams that were seen as really top teams at that tournament. Loud going very deep, so looking much better at the start of the tournament than they did at the start of Tokyo, and they start their playoff bracket with a pretty easy draw in Billy Gaming. Yes, they had the upset against Energy, but they didn't beat anyone else that tournament, so DRX made pretty quick work of them. But then they moved on to face Evil Geniuses, hoping to get revenge from losing against them at Tokyo, but that would not be the case. They would lose that one 2-0. So getting sent down to the lower bracket, who do they find but Fnatic, a team that had just won back-to-back tournaments at Tokyo and Lock-In. And while DRX were able to take a 1-map lead by beating Fnatic 13-1 on Bind, they would collapse almost immediately after winning that map, losing the next one 13-9 and then the next one 13-6, ending DRX's 2023 in disappointment. And this would be the last time that the Vision Strikers / DRX roster were together in full. There were roster changes in the offseason. RB and Zest kicked from the roster, and then 2024 would prove to be a very tumultuous year for this organization. They still had most of the pieces of that roster in Stax, Buzz, and Mako, and they brought in previous sub Foxy9 to be part of the main roster, as well as a young player named Flashback. However, they didn't qualify for any international tournaments until Champions, and by the time we got to Champions, the roster had changed quite quite a bit. They just weren't looking the same regionally as they usually did. It seemed like the losses of RB and Zest were more than we could have expected. So DRX ended up basically changing out their entire roster. Stax was gone mid-season. So while DRX would qualify for that last international of the year, Stax was not a part of that run. And at Champions 2024, with this new version of DRX, which was a mix of the old players in Mako and Buzz, and then this new fresh mix of Bane, Flashback, as well as Foxy9, they ended up doing very similarly to what they have done in the past, a 5th to 6th placement. Yet again, getting out of the group stage 2-0. They're very good in group stages for some reason. However, facing off against Sentinels in the start of the playoff bracket did not prove favorable for them. Then they ended up facing off against Trace Esports, yet another Chinese team coming off of some upset wins. Made pretty quick work of that, but then they faced Team Heretics, the eventual runners-up of the tournament, yet again running into a runner-up. And they did take a map, 13-5 on Abyss, but then Heretics did the same exact thing to them. 13-5 for Heretics on Sunset, and then 13-10 for Heretics on Icebox. And that was it. That was the last time Buzz played for DRX. Mako would remain on the team, but Buzz was basically kicked off the roster and chose to go to T1 to revisit with Stax. Buzz at that Champions 2024 tournament had 198 kills, 178 deaths, 40 assists for key ratio of 1.11, a very consistent number for him. And Buzz, joining his old friend in Stax, would finally find the success that he had been craving. It didn't look like that at first. T1 in the offseason had a very strong run at tournaments like Red Bull Homeground, winning that tournament. But then while they would be winning games at kickoff, there seemed to be internal issues. Things weren't going great for the team. They would win games, but always lose a map in those games, and then eventually get knocked down to lower bracket by DRX. So Stax and Buzz not able to get the revenge on their previous organization that they had been wanting. They would move down to lower bracket, they beat Gen G to be able to make it to the grand final to rematch against DRX, and after a very close 5-map game, they ended up losing. Mako finally winning his first regional trophy, and Buzz and Stax watching from the loser's side. It seemed like Buzz and Stax just weren't going to win anything. They finally get out of DRX, they join the super team, and then their old organization ends up being a better team than they were. It just seemed like there was no way for these guys to win. But that would change very quickly. VCT Masters Bangkok, the most recent at the time of recording international tournament in Valorant. Dare I say, one of the best tournaments in Valorant as well. While there were only 8 teams, there was some incredibly high level of play, and we would start the tournament with a Swiss stage where T1 would face off in a random draw against Vitality. Vitality, the EMEA super team, they would win against T1 2-0. So now T1's backs were against the wall. If they lose their next match, they're out of the whole thing. They end up facing off against Trace Esports. They win that one pretty convincingly, and then for the match to decide who goes to the playoff stage, they face off against DRX. It could not have been more poetic. Buzz and Stax on this new team at the international level, finally trying to win something, and DRX, the organization that did them dirty and could not get them that trophy. And T1 were able to get the job done. They beat DRX 2-0. Very impressive last map from them, beating them 13-4. Buzz standing up saying, "Who's the best team in Korea now?" I can't imagine how good that felt.
What's up, guys? Who's the best team in Korea now? Come on!
So they end up in the playoff stage, but a lot of doubts for T1 from analysts and commenters alike, me included, to be honest. They were my pick to win champs, so I was right that they were gonna win a tournament. I was just too late. However, they end up facing off against Edward Gaming, the previous champs winners, and the champs winners were able to win that one. 2-1 victory. T1 would make it close after having a pretty rough first half on that first map, but they get knocked down to that lower bracket where they have to rematch against Team Vitality. However, by showing some pretty good ability in those rematches, T1 got it done. Stax and Buzz going deep in this tournament, they get their top 3 appearance. The first time they had done that since lock-in. This time with a player that many of you know by the name of Meteor. Meteor being part of the Gen G roster that finally won VC Pacific's very first trophy in 2024, being a part of one of the best teams the game has ever seen, so moving on to this T1 team, his influence was great. Yes, the chemistry didn't work right away, but as soon as they got it going, this team seemed unstoppable. Playing unpredictable comps, using double duelists to get the job done, playing a lot more unconventionally than a lot of teams were, and it worked. And then they rematched against Edward Gaming in a best of 5, and they win it in 4. 3-1, winning the last map 13-5, Stax and Buzz are finally in a grand final. And in that grand final, awaiting them is G2, an America's team, a region that on these two players' previous teams had their number quite a bit. And G2 up until that point had looked like the best team at that tournament. They had only lost one match against Edward Gaming, and then they bounced back in a very impressive way, beating Vitality and Edward Gaming. But T1 had done the same exact thing, just a little bit of a harder road. And these two teams proceed to have the closest grand final that we have ever had in the VCT. Going all the way into map 5 overtime, T1 were able to do it. 16-14 was the final scoreline. Stax and Buzz, after a grueling tournament, a grueling 5 separate years of being a part of this esport, they finally got their first trophy. The second trophy for VCT Pacific, the second trophy for Meteor, but most importantly, the years of blood, sweat, tears, hard work, disappointment, good placements, bad placements, all this stuff, all this disappointment, finally, it paid off for these two players. Buzz and Stax had an incredible tournament for themselves. Buzz, 370 kills, 331 deaths, 107 assists for key ratio of 1.11. And Stax, 284 kills, 282 deaths, 154 assists for key ratio of 1. And they did it. They lifted that trophy. I've never seen them look happier. It's just an incredible story of just years of failures after failures. It is one of the best stories in all of Valorant. That's why I was happy when T1 won, even though I was cheering for G2. You would be hard-pressed to find two players more deserving of a trophy than Buzz and Stax. As I said, this doesn't happen very often where you see players play this game for so long. They've been here since the beginning. They've consistently been very good. They've just never been able to get over the hump. Being a part of one organization for a very long time, and you prove them wrong almost immediately. So that's it. That is the story of Buzz and Stax's long road to a VCT trophy. Very impressive story for these two players, and the story is not over. There's a lot more Valorant left to be played this year, and we'll see how they do in the rest of the year and beyond. Let me know in the comment section down below, what did you think of this video? How do you feel about these two players finally getting that first win? Let me know all of that and more in the comment section down below. Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.